I always prided myself on my ability to captivate a classroom. As Professor Exalvern of the esteemed Galactic Academy, I had spent over a century unraveling the mysteries of ancient civilizations and lost species. My lectures on the rise and fall of great empires, the evolutionary quirks of long-extinct beings, and the philosophical musings of civilizations that never reached the stars were renowned throughout the academic world. But today's lecture was something special. I flicked my mandibles in anticipation as my students settled into their seats, their various forms adjusting to the gravity stabilizers in the room. There were over 30 students today, a mix of species, each representing a different world from across the Union. They came to my class for one reason: to study what could not be explained, to peer into the past and make sense of the myths that persisted even in an age of interstellar enlightenment. They examined storylines, myths, legends, demons, and horror films. Today, we would be discussing one of the most baffling legends of all: humans. The holoscreens around me flickered to life, projecting a vast array of images in the air before us. Some depicted towering war machines with blackened hulls. Others displayed strange bipedal creatures wrapped in primitive armor, brandishing weapons of metal and energy alike. A few images were more abstract, symbols scrawled onto ancient ruins, fragments of coded messages retrieved from drifting derelicts, words in a language long forgotten. Today, I began, my voice calm yet commanding, we explore the myths surrounding humans. A few murmurs rippled through the classroom. My students had heard of them, of course. Everyone had. The ghost stories, the exaggerations, the impossible claims. Humanity, they were taught, was an old legend, an anomaly that had no place in rational history. Their existence had never been proven, and their supposed feats defied logic. And yet, the myths endured. I gestured toward the largest projection, a massive bipedal figure clad in thick, rugged armor. It was humanoid in shape, but its stance exuded something alien, something unnerving. Even as an image, there was something off about it, as though it were looking at the viewer, assessing them, preparing for something unknown. According to legend, I continued, humans were a paradox. By all known biological standards, they were weak, flesh-based beings with fragile skeletal structures, unable to endure extreme heat, cold, or vacuum without technological assistance. Yet, stories claim they were capable of surviving conditions that would destroy most known life forms. My brightest student, Yukel, raised a delicate chitinous limb. Professor, didn't the High Council officially classify humans as a fabrication, a collection of unrelated anomalies that various civilizations mistakenly attributed to a single mythical species? I clicked my mandibles in agreement. Exactly. There is no scientific evidence they ever truly existed. The claims surrounding them are inconsistent at best and wildly implausible at worst. Entire records of wars where they supposedly fought have no surviving physical evidence. The so-called human relics have all turned out to be hoaxes or misidentified artifacts. Their alleged influence on galactic history simply does not add up. There was a ripple of laughter from some students. It was all absurd, after all. The idea that a species could defy all odds, rise beyond its evolutionary station, and accomplish feats thought impossible was pure fantasy. It was a comforting idea, a cautionary tale, a relic of an unenlightened age when civilizations explained the unexplainable with stories. I clasped my upper hands together. The idea that a species could break its natural limits, adapt faster than any other, and refuse to surrender under any circumstance? Preposterous. And that was when the alarm klaxons blared. The sudden blare of the alarm shattered the quiet atmosphere of the lecture hall. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the Academy's intercom system, laced with the cold precision of an artificial intelligence. Attention! Unauthorized vessel detected. Breach in Docking Bay 3. Security teams, report immediately. The lights flickered, and for a moment the holoscreens displaying human myths distorted into static before snapping back to clarity. The Academy was one of the most secure institutions in the Union, a fortress of knowledge floating in the void between galaxies. Nothing unauthorized ever got inside. Nothing. I turned sharply toward my students, many of whom were looking around in confusion, their appendages twitching nervously. Yakel's normally composed expression was tight with unease, his luminous eyes reflecting the red emergency lights that now pulsed along the walls. "Remain calm," I instructed, though even I felt an unfamiliar tension creeping into my thorax. "Security will handle this situation." But before the words had fully left my mandibles, the reinforced doors at the back of the hall let out a sharp, mechanical hiss, then slid open, and in walked a human. The room fell into absolute silence. The figure was tall, nearly as tall as a Valtari warrior, though not nearly as bulky. Its body was encased in a strange mix of armor and fabric, the material looking both lightweight and durable. Dark boots struck the floor with a deliberate rhythm as it strode forward, each step exuding a confidence that seemed wholly unearned for a being that, according to science, should not exist. Its face was uncovered, pale skin roughened with faint scars, a strong jawline, short brown hair, and small, piercing eyes that scanned the room with an unsettling sharpness. Those eyes locked onto me. Then it smiled. "Professor Exelvorn, right?" The voice was deep, smooth, yet disturbingly casual. "Sorry to crash the lecture, but we need to talk." I did not move. I could not. Every logical part of my mind screamed that this was a trick, an illusion, an elaborate hoax, and yet there it stood. My students were paralyzed in their seats, their body languages a mixture of disbelief and raw fear. A few clutched their datapads like shields, as if academic records could ward off the impossible. Even Yakel, ever the skeptic, was rigid, his secondary arms twitching as if debating whether to reach for a weapon that wasn't there. The human continued walking until it stood directly in front of me. Too close. The scent of something foreign, sweat, metal, and something faintly burnt drifted from its form. My voice felt unnatural, unsteady. "You cannot be real." The human smirked. "Yeah, we get that a lot." I opened my mandibles to respond, but before I could, my datapad vibrated violently. A priority message flashed across the screen. "Academy overwrite, Union High Command Directive. New classification, humans confirmed. All factually report immediately." I felt a chill settle over me. The High Command never made declarations so suddenly, never without extensive review, without certainty. Yet here it was, in stark white letters. Humans were no longer a myth, and one was standing right in front of me. For several long, agonizing seconds, my brain refused to process what was happening. A human, a living, breathing human, stood in front of me, casually existing as though it had every right to be here. This was impossible. Humans were myths, anomalies that civilizations long past had invented to explain the inexplicable. They were an absurdity, a story told to children and over-imaginative scholars alike. And yet, there he was. The classroom remained frozen in place, every student watching in stunned silence. Some were gripping their desks with rigid limbs, while others had gone completely still, their bodies tensed, as though movement alone might provoke the creature standing before us. I forced myself to breathe, my mandibles clicking involuntarily as I tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. I was an academic, not some frightened civilian. My duty was to understand, to seek knowledge. And so I spoke. "You are lying," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my mind. "This is a trick, a deception." The human raised an eyebrow. It was a strange gesture, one I recognized from the scattered cultural records I had studied. The expression seemed to convey amusement, or perhaps mild disbelief. "Yeah, no," he replied, shifting his weight slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that made my unease deepen. "I get why you'd think that, though. Sounds crazy, right? A myth barging into your classroom, mid-lecture?" He let out a short, sharp exhale that I realized was laughter. "You should see your face, by the way." Yichel, my brightest student, found his voice before I could. His chitinous fingers tightened around the edge of his desk as he spoke, his words slow, deliberate. "You expect us to believe you are human?" He spat the word as though it were venom. "That you, a species that does not exist, simply walked into one of the most secure institutions in the galaxy?" The human shrugged. "Pretty much, yeah." The sheer audacity of the statement sent a ripple of disbelief through the class. A few students exchanged wary glances, their expressions flickering between fear and the desperate hope that this was some elaborate academic stunt. I narrowed my eyes. "Then explain yourself. Who are you? How did you get here?" The human exhaled sharply again, but this time his expression became more serious. "Captain James Walker, Terran Expeditionary Fleet," he said, standing a little straighter. "And how I got here? Well," he glanced toward the door. "Your security is good, but it's not that good." A wave of alarm spread through the class. The implications of what he had just said were clear. If a single human had managed to infiltrate this station, then what else was possible? I took a step back, my mind racing. "Then answer me this, Captain Walker. Where have you been? If humans ever existed, you have been missing for thousands of cycles. If you truly are what you claim, then why return now?" The human's expression darkened. "Because," he said, voice quieter now, weightier, "we've been watching, and we don't like what we've seen." The weight of his words settled over the classroom like a dense, suffocating fog. "We've been watching." The implication was staggering. For thousands of cycles, humanity had been considered a myth, an anomaly that never truly existed, or, at best, a civilization that had burned itself out long before reaching the galactic stage. And yet, this human stood before me, claiming that his species had not only survived, but had been observing us from the shadows. It was unthinkable. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to maintain my composure. My students were watching, waiting for an explanation, for me to take control of the situation. But for the first time in my academic career, I had no answers. I folded my lower arms behind my back, a habit I had developed when deep in thought. "You claim your species has been watching us," I said carefully. "Explain. Where have you been? Why did humanity disappear?" Walker exhaled sharply through his nose, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as frustration. He moved to the center of the room, his boots striking against the floor with a rhythmic certainty. When he spoke, his tone was measured but firm. "We never disappeared," he said. "We left." A murmur rippled through the students. I saw Yiquel's mandibles twitch, a sign of disbelief. A reptilian student near the back let out a scoffing sound, while another simply stared, wide-eyed, unable to process what they were hearing. I latched onto his words. Left? Why? What possible reason could an entire species have for abandoning the galaxy? Walker turned, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. "Because we realized something no one else had." He paused. "We were too different." The class fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down like the gravity of a neutron star. He continued, his voice steady but edged with something I couldn't quite define. "Every species we encountered had limits. Cultural, biological, psychological. There were rules. Things that couldn't be done. Things that wouldn't even be considered. But us?" He shook his head. We broke every rule. He gestured toward the holoscreen still flickering with images of supposed mythological humans. We weren't the strongest, but we fought harder. We weren't the smartest, but we adapted faster. We weren't the fastest, but we endured. We outthought, outbuilt, and outlasted everything the galaxy threw at us. I felt a cold realization creeping into my thorax. If what he said was true, humans weren't just another species. They were a force of nature. Walker's expression hardened, and the galaxy didn't like that. Equel found his voice, though it was laced with skepticism. You're suggesting the rest of the galaxy turned against you, that the Union, the very foundation of interstellar civilization, saw humanity as a threat? Walker's jaw tightened. Not at first. At first, we were the underdogs, the upstarts. Then we started winning. We survived wars we should have lost. We made breakthroughs we shouldn't have. We climbed faster, adapted quicker. And when the rest of the galaxy realized we weren't going to slow down, he let the words hang. I felt my pulse quicken. They forced you out? Walker's expression was unreadable. Not forced, he said. Encouraged. My stomach twisted. I had spent my life studying ancient civilizations, the rise and fall of great species. And yet, the idea that an entire race, one that had seemingly defied every expectation, could simply choose to leave, was beyond anything I had ever encountered. I stepped forward feeling an unsettling mix of curiosity and dread. Then why return now? If you left willingly, why reveal yourselves after all this time? Walker met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Because we gave you time to grow, he said, and you wasted it. His words sent a shiver through me, as if an unseen force had brushed against my exoskeleton. We wasted it. The classroom, once filled with the hushed murmurs of disbelief, had gone completely silent. The weight of his accusation pressed down on every student present, on me, on the very institution we stood within. The Galactic Academy, the beacon of knowledge, the pride of the Union, had spent centuries cataloging the past, dissecting history, ensuring the mistakes of fallen civilizations were never repeated. And yet, here stood a being that should not exist, telling us we had failed. I folded my arms, steeling myself. Explain, I demanded. What have we wasted? Walker exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly, as if loosening some invisible weight. We left to give you a chance, he said. A chance to figure things out on your own, to prove that the galaxy could evolve without us being the disruptive force we always were. His expression darkened. But nothing changed. You're still making the same mistakes, still letting bureaucracy, stagnation, and complacency dictate your future. A low, indignant chittering rose from some of my students. One, a Valtari with crimson scales, let out a sharp hiss. That's absurd. The Union has prospered for thousands of cycles. We have peace, stability, progress. Walker turned toward the speaker, fixing him with a gaze so sharp, so calculating that even the reptilian student flinched slightly. Peace? Walker repeated. You call this peace? He gestured broadly, as if encompassing not just the room but the entire academy, the entire Union. You've stopped expanding. Your technology plateaus every few centuries. The same civilizations sit on the High Council, ensuring nothing ever truly changes. You don't advance, you maintain. And maintenance isn't growth. He let his arms drop to his sides. That's not peace, that's stagnation. I felt a sharp sting of anger rise within me. And what would you have us do? War? Chaos? Conflict? Is that what you think progress means? To my surprise, Walker shook his head. No, he said simply, but challenges force evolution. Pressure creates strength. Humanity was forged in the fires of adversity. We should have died 100 times over, but we didn't, because we refused to accept the limits imposed on us. His eyes met mine. You don't have that anymore. You've insulated yourselves, built a system that prevents true hardship, true struggle. You think you've created a utopia, but what you've really done is put the galaxy in a cage, safe, predictable, weak. A quiet stillness followed his words. My students were no longer scoffing, no longer whispering among themselves. They were listening. I knew they had been taught as I had, that progress was slow, steady, methodical, that too much change too quickly led to ruin. But Walker's words cut through that carefully constructed belief, exposing something raw beneath it. For the first time, I wondered if perhaps our greatest achievement, stability, was in fact our greatest failing. I took a step closer to Walker. "And so you return," I said, voice quieter now, tinged with something I couldn't quite define. "To do what?" Walker studied me for a long moment. Then he smiled. "To remind the galaxy why it used to be afraid of the dark." A chill settled over the room. It wasn't the artificial climate control of the academy or the sterile perfection of the environment. It was something deeper, something primal. I saw it in the way my students shifted in their seats, in the way their breathing quickened, in the way their eyes locked onto the human as if seeing, for the first time, the shape of something they had long been told was nothing more than a shadow. Fear. And not the kind of fear one feels in the presence of a monster or an unknown threat. This was something else entirely. A slow, creeping realization that the universe was no longer as safe, as orderly, as controlled as we had believed. Walker had not moved. He stood there, watching me, waiting for my reaction. That smirk of his was gone now, replaced by something colder, something calculating. I forced myself to speak. "Afraid of the dark?" I repeated. "Is that what you think humanity represents? A phantom from the past? A warning?" Walker exhaled sharply through his nose again, a gesture I had begun to associate with amusement, but this time there was no humor in his expression. "No," he said simply. "We're the ones who survived the dark, and we came back to see if the rest of you had finally learned how." A murmur ran through the classroom. Some of my students exchanged uneasy glances. Ukel, ever the skeptic, clenched his mandibles tightly before speaking. "You talk as if the galaxy was meant to be a constant battlefield," he said. "That, without struggle, without conflict, civilizations grow weak." Walker nodded. "Exactly." Ukel's chitinous fingers curled against his desk. "That is barbaric." Walker's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is it?" he asked, tilting his head. "Tell me something. When was the last time your species faced a true existential threat? When was the last time any of you had to fight for survival, to innovate not for comfort, but because failure meant extinction?" I started to answer, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was, it had been millennia. The Union's great wars had ended long before my time. Conflicts had been replaced with diplomacy, resource shortages solved with careful galactic planning, disease eradicated by advancements in medical science. We were, as the High Council often proclaimed, in the golden age of civilization. But Walker's words gnawed at me. Had we truly advanced? Or had we merely stopped moving? Walker took a slow step forward. My students tensed as one, but he ignored them, his gaze locked onto mine. "The thing about the dark," he said, voice quieter now, "is that it doesn't go away just because you close your eyes." The weight of his words settled over me. "We left," he continued, "because we saw what was coming. We saw how the Union was setting itself up to crumble under its own weight. No predators, no dangers, just endless stagnation." His lips pressed into a thin line. "And we knew that when the real threats came, you wouldn't be ready." A cold unease settled into my chest. "What threats?" I asked carefully. Walker's expression darkened. The kind you haven't even noticed yet, he said, because you stopped looking. The room felt impossibly small. My students, once brimming with skepticism and academic detachment, now sat in uneasy silence. Even Yi Quell, who had been the most vocal in his disbelief, said nothing. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken questions that no one dared to voice. Walker's words echoed in my mind. The kind you haven't even noticed yet. A slow, creeping sense of dread settled over me. The Union had spent millennia ensuring stability, eliminating conflict, and fostering peace. It was the foundation upon which all of our civilizations rested. And yet, if Walker was to be believed, we had not created an enduring utopia. We had simply blinded ourselves to the dangers beyond our borders. I forced myself to speak. You claim there is a threat we do not see. If this is true, then why not warn us? Why not reveal yourselves sooner? Walker's gaze was unreadable. Because we weren't sure if you were worth saving. A ripple of shock passed through the classroom. A few students gasped. Others stiffened, their faces hardening with anger. How dare you? One of them hissed, voice tight with fury. You speak as though humanity is superior, as if we are beneath your judgment. Walker didn't react to the outrage. If anything, he seemed to expect it. He let the anger hang in the air for a moment before answering. You misunderstand, he said. This isn't about superiority, it's about survival. Humanity has been out there, beyond the edges of your civilized little bubble. We've seen things you can't even comprehend. And we learned the hard way that the universe doesn't care about peace. It doesn't care about stability. It only cares about one thing. He lifted a single finger and tapped it lightly against his temple. Who's ready? A cold realization settled over me. He wasn't just warning us, he was telling us in no uncertain terms that the Union wasn't. I swallowed hard. And what is coming, Walker? What have you seen? Walker's eyes darkened. Predators, he said simply. Not the kind you're used to. Not warlords or rogue fleets or border skirmishes. He shook his head. You've only ever known threats that play by the rules. I felt my exoskeleton tighten involuntarily. And these predators? They don't negotiate, Walker said. They don't seek alliances. They don't care about treaties, ethics, or philosophy. They consume. They expand. They win. His voice was quiet, but there was something terrifying in its certainty. For the first time in my life, I felt something I never had before. Helplessness. Walker studied me for a long moment before sighing. Look, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. We could have stayed hidden. Could have watched from the sidelines, let the galaxy deal with the consequences of its own decisions. He paused. But that's not who we are. He straightened. It has never been who we are. I realized in that moment what he was saying. Humanity hadn't just returned to warn us. They had returned to fight. For us. For the galaxy. And the terrifying question that now burned in my mind was, would we be strong enough to fight beside them?